So we are recording.
Yeah.
So
We started chapter 7
yes,
for this
we
week.
began with some. I don't have a lot of. You can see I have some very sparse notes, and I've made a couple of things in the margins. I don't mind admitting circumstances, not necessarily connected to the book, as you know, have just left me feeling a little flat the last little while, and I haven't necessarily done my best readerly reading in the last probably 2 meetings, like this meeting and last meeting.
Yeah.
I definitely have some stuff to say. I feel like I got a good sense of what's
Yeah.
going on, but I will say I've been sort of going through a kind of fatigue cycle, I think,
Yeah.
that affects us. But I'll say, because I know that my tendency sometimes is to trend toward the gloomy. I will say something that this week's reading had that really stood out to me was just some great subchapter titles. I mean, there was just a lot of. There's some poetry happening.
Yeah,
Some
including the continued
Yes,
conclusion.
yes, right.
Yeah, which we'll get to.
So I
yeah.
thought there was some really good stuff going on with that. But
Well, and even the first subsection of chapter 7, By the Ocean of Time.
And I have to say I sighed. I was like, oh no!
I know.
Are we back into time?
And we were.
And we were.
And I'll add, just let's do a little synopsis. We're about 100 pages away from finishing. We read about half of chapter 7.
Yeah.
Today's discussion starts with By the Ocean of Time and ends just before Fullness of Harmony. So what we got was the whole Peepercorn section for those out there who might be watching this that have read the novel before.
Yeah.
This week got all the Peepercorn.
We got the beginning, middle, and end.
We got all of it.
Of meaner Peepercorn.
Meaner Peepercorn. And before meeting him, we got this By the Ocean of Time sequence, which, in my view, and I also have had a kind of haggard couple of weeks, and it's been a minute, but as I remember this By the Ocean of Time, and I wrote, oh, comma, God, next to that, as you can see here, so I was feeling what you were feeling. But my memory of this section is that it was Thomas Mann's way of saying, how long has it been since Joachim died? How long has Hans been here? Really can't tell you, because you know how it is when time just slides on by. Let's just say it's been a minute.
Yeah.
And that to me was kind of like what was going on in that section in a nutshell. It was like making sure that you felt like you didn't know what was going on time-wise. And it was funny, the last question that we asked, the last video was, will Claudia come back? And we said yes, and then three pages into the Ocean of Time, he's like, oh, by the way, she's been
Claudia.
back for a while.
Yeah.
Then we're like, oh.
Right.
Then we got all the Peepercorn, and he dominated, the middle of the reading. And then after his death, we ended up with one more section where the Hofrat is trying, I think, to convince Hans, look, you don't even have tuberculosis. You've got some version of strep throat or something.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to prove it to you so you can go ahead and get out of here.
Right.
And Hans is dealing with that. And that's the synopsis of where we stop. It was Peepercorn all the way, with some time loop in the beginning, and with Hans maybe not even having TB at all at the end.
Yeah. I think well, I think he did have it, for sure, but I think, the Hofrat is now saying, looking at your x-rays, things seem to be different. We can't, it's just this temperature thing we can't figure out. But before we get all the way past the oceans of time, I will say, I when we get to the very end here on 575, I did sort of feel like it was a bit of a meager payoff. The interest rate was pretty low on this investment, but it was still a bit of a payoff to get to the very end and get this kind of summation. May we set it down on the credit side, and I love that we're still using this kind of terms, the business terminology. Set it down to the credit side of Hans Kostorp's account that he had been strengthened in this vicious time economy, his baleful traffic with eternity, by seeing that all his cousin's zeal, called doggedness by a certain melancholy blusterer, had but the more surely brought him to a fatal end.
Yeah.
Question mark. Yeah. And I think there's this, Joachim is weighing heavily on him. I think we buried Joachim in the last reading, but he's sort of present, especially in some of the sections with Claudia, maybe like 2/3 of the way through today's reading. It's a thing.
Yeah, they talk about him,
and it's obviously something that's on Hans's mind. This conviction that Joachim knew he was going back to Flatland and to die.
Yeah,
and that he just decided it was worth it. And so I think this return, this departure from the mountain, has taken on some really serious proportions for Hans, which is part of the reason why this conversation about the streptococcal is a big deal for him with Baron. But obviously today really is about peppercorn. More than anything else. And I'll say this, and then I'll kind of be quiet for a minute because I don't know that I have a whole lot to add. But I'll say I can't decide whether I think Thomas Mann is just a maniac or a genius, but to get 600 pages into a novel and then say, you know what we need now? This whole new gigantic character who's going to redefine the question of the book.
Yeah.
I'm still just sort of floored at the kind of nuclear bomb that this character is. At least for me, and maybe I'm just reading it wrong.
No, he is.
The incredible disruption of what I thought was this kind of pretty clearly defined thing that this guy is, and I think will continue to be, even after
he's so much like it's clearly the type of character that you could write a whole novel about. Raises a lot of interesting questions, makes you think different things than you thought in the first 600 pages. Some of them very interesting to me personally. Some of them I think just interesting intellectually in the context of the book. Like, for example, intellectually in the context of the book, he's referred to as her protector several times. Mm-hmm. Mann himself, third-person narrator, refers to him as her protector. There is this way in which somehow, I know not how, the question of her being married and also potentially a gold digger, and at no point really loving him, but somehow honoring him and letting him shower her with his money and his time and his attention. None of this within the moral universe of the book works against her at all.
Yeah.
This is not Anna Nicole Smith, for those of you that are over 40, right? This is not Anna Nicole Smith here. This is somebody whose due it is to be protected by somebody exactly like Peppercorn. That is the moral universe that we're looking at here. There is no judging her for this.
Yeah, and Claudia and Hans talk about this.
Right.
I think around 6:30.
Not that I have a problem with Anna Nicole Smith, I'm just saying.
No, it's a little 6:28, 6:29, somewhere around there. They're having this moment, right? Mm-hmm. And it's this kind of classic. Actually, it goes a little further. It starts around 6:25.
Oh, okay.
She comes and asks him for a stamp,
and it's just like put out because he doesn't have one.
Right, and then takes a cigarette from him instead.
Yeah.
There's this intimacy. There's almost this kind of like, kind of bickering.
Well, he calls her spoiled, at that point, and
Yeah.
again, in a way that is almost like giving her praise.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Like, I'll just have your cigarette then. Like, something about this is attractive to Thomas Mann, and let's be honest, to the reader.
Well, there's an intimacy and a comfort, right? That there's that kind of point where you get past like best manners with people, because they become kind of a given.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of. I think, so my understanding is, he had this moment at the carnival night with her. that felt like the real possible beginnings of something, and then she leaves the next morning. She's this kind of, I don't know, this kind of idea that he kind of lives around for a while, however long. And then she returns with this Peppercorn character, who made me think a lot about Gargantua, from the Rabelais. Made me think a little bit about Colonel Kurtz, and I think partly it's a weird connection that I'm making there, but just this huge, larger than life. You know who also made me think about a little bit was Ben Fisher.
A person that we know. Yeah,
just this touch of greatness, of a capital G greatness. And
I want to return to that. Like, remind me that I want to talk about capital G greatness. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the theme of the reading. I think, in a way. But so Hans is having this kind of. There's this interesting, I think, early on in the reading, there's this interesting mechanic where Hans doesn't know what to do, right? His girlfriend comes back from summer vacation with a boyfriend, and he's kind of put out, and so he adopts this kind of aloofness, right? Which feels very immature, but also feels very like relatable, right? It's very much like this is what you do when you're a boy, and you can't like hit girls on the playground anymore to show them you like them, and you're all out of tricks, and so he adopts this aloofness. And it feels like this moment around 6:25 when she comes for the stamp, it finally cracks. And they actually talk to each other, and
she does some really forward things in this chapter. She plays with his hair. She plays with his fingers.
Well, this ends with that kiss.
Yeah, and the kiss. And she initiates all the physical.
Yes.
Hans trying to be aloof,
right?
Not really succeeding.
Right. And I think part of what's happening is, she is, to some extent, she is trying to explain to him what's going on. And what's going on, I mean, there's all this elaborate stuff, but what's really going on is Peppercorn is capital G great, and you have no choice in the face of that greatness, right? She's like, I don't really love him, but he loves me, and I can't not respect that in this man. And I think part of what's happened by this point, by 6:25, 6:27, whatever, Hans has begun to recognize it too. He thinks of Peppercorn as the same kind of great, and they enter into this. I don't know what to call it exactly. It's almost like this kind of love affair by proxy, where they say, because we both understand his bigness, and Hans keeps talking about it in terms of personality, right? Because they both understand it, it's an intimacy that they couldn't otherwise achieve. To share this understanding of Peppercorn and to kind of serve him, and it's almost like what Naphtha thinks the church gives, and it's almost what Settembrini thinks, that humanism gives. That Peppercorn arrives, this hurricane of a man, and disrupts this neat little binary that Hans has comfortably been kind of settled into, and gives him this third path, and he takes it.
Yeah, and I have some mixed feelings about it, but that was definitely another one of the places that I found intellectually engaging in the context of the novel, is this concept of capital G greatness, which I bring in you Historis's perspective to this, and I think that if we know anything about the modernists, we know that in the wake of World War I, they rejected the idea of capital G greatness. Mm-hmm. I want to preface this comment by saying I cannot believe that Thomas Mann is giving us this character and the other character's response to him without irony.
Right.
Like, I believe that what's happening here is that we're seeing this last gasp of the romantic, capital R, impulse of being willing to designate greatness upon personalities and people and shroud them in this stuff. And I find that interesting. And I guess we can get into more why I think it's ironic, but I think ultimately arms and legs and eyeballs being blown all over the continent changed some people's minds, about like how much we really care about capital G great anymore anyway. But they're isolated on this mountain.
Yeah.
In the way that we all were before the Great War, in the way some would say we are today.
Right.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? I mean, because even Nafta and Settembrini, though frustrated, also seem to cede. Everyone seems to cede the greatness. But Mon, part of why I think it's ironic is there's this tongue-in-cheek on a couple of levels. Number one, as soon as we meet him, first thing we find out is that he's a tycoon. He's a wealthy coffee tycoon.
Right.
Well, that right there, just go on the internet for 5 minutes. If you're a billionaire, you can come across as great with a capital G. Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban, Elon Musk. You can come across as just dropping these pearls. Why? Because you have all these billions in the fucking bank. I believe that the money is emphasized a little too much for me to believe that Mon isn't mocking how we conflate money with greatness. And the second thing is he's so fucking stupid. And I get that he's also canny in his way. Like, he figured out that Hans loved Claudia. And I'll even go further and say there are things about Pieper Corn that I find quite decent. But the idea that he's a great man, not only do I agree with you that he dropped a nuclear bomb 600 pages in, but it's the most absurd thing, right? Like, I just feel like, how can you not roll your eyes at this guy? And, like, his pronouncements make no sense.
Right.
If it were,
he can't even finish a sentence. Everything just kind of tails off.
But it's something about his self-confidence.
Right.
And that comes from the money.
Right.
And so I want to emphasize that, and maybe we'll get back into that a little bit. But on a personal note, I found another part of Pieper Corn's entrance and the dynamic you're naming interesting, and I just want to sound you out about this. This is something for, I don't know, whatever reason I've been thinking about lately. This book raises some interesting questions about the nature of jealousy to me. It seems to annoy Claudia herself.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the reader, like Mon, feels like he's got to defend Hans's friendship with Pieper Corn to the reader. And Hans has to defend it to Settembrini.
Right.
Like, conventional wisdom is, if it's the girl you like, you can't be buddies with her guy.
Right.
And I find it to be, just personally, I don't know how it holds up intellectually, but I find it to be fucking cool that Hans just goes ahead and be friends with this guy, even though he's head over heels in love with Claudia. And it was really the first time I've seen him really flout convention in a way that feels personal and real. People might be laughing at you because, he got your girl. Mm-hmm. It's like, so what? I find him interesting.
Right.
That's, to me, kind of fucking cool. And to me, Thomas Mann challenging one of the real bedrock, I think, problems with masculinity. That right. Guys feel like everything's contingent, where they're supposed to feel like everything's contingent on who gets the girl or who gets the money or who gets this. And just the way in which he told Settembrini and others to pound sand, including Claudia.
Yeah.
I dug that about him. What do you think about that?
So I'm torn. I like what you're saying there, and I think that is a more optimistic reading than initially occurred to me. Mm-hmm. I keep coming back to this section on 594.
Yeah.
I have a kind of a kind of personally inflected take. I don't want to presume about you, but I feel like, as a guy growing up in the second half of the 20th century, I was presented with these role models, sometimes through media, sometimes in real life, at whose feet I was clearly supposed to kind of learn the rules, or if not learn the rules, at least like properly respect the thing that these role models, all men, stood for.
Yeah.
And I feel like, as a guy who kind of got into reading pretty early on, really in my early teens, I would say, I started seeing these things. I'm thinking in particular of people like Erskine Caldwell, Ernest Hemingway, Harry Crews, some of these Grit South people, and even to some extent the genre writers like the noir detectives and the mysteries, and I'm really touched. There's that first kind of big banquet where Peppercorn, what seems like kind of late at night.
Yeah, he just has a huge
it's
dinner
just like,
party.
we're going to have a party.
Yeah.
Wake up the kitchen.
Yeah.
And as a couple of guys who worked restaurants, I think we know that moment. I mean, I've been on both sides of this.
Yeah.
Never because I was rich, but because, I worked with people who were connected to restaurants, and you could. I mean, I don't know how it worked. I was never back of the house as much, but we would front of the house. We would trade out. Like on my off days, I would go to my friends' restaurants or my friends' bars, and like hang out with them while they were at work, sort of.
Yeah.
And along the way, like buy drinks or buy a meal or whatever. And then this would sometimes become a thing where it'd be like, hey, I'm getting cut at 10:30. We can go to this third place, and it would become a kind of traveling circus, where we would go collect this person and then go to this, until we were at the 4 a.m. bar,
right?
And it felt a bit like it felt familiar, I'll say, in that sense.
Yeah.
And the other way it felt familiar was the way that Peppercorn is just holding court. I mean, he is in command of the table,
absolutely,
and in this way that especially felt like elements of grad school and to some degree undergrad for me. I remember, for instance, I was never part of the MFA program where I went to school, but there was a big, robust MFA program, and it wasn't like that weird to like go to a restaurant, go to a restaurant to like get an after dinner drink at their bar, and then look into the dining room and see one of the MFA professors sort of holding court.
That's right.
With a bunch of students or the like.
Yeah.
Jim Harrison, the great Jim Harrison, never taught at the program where I was in, but he read a lot doing the circuit in that town, and would absolutely it was just this given that he would do his reading. Like he would sit in the back behind the curtain and drink until he was ready to read, and you just sat in the audience and waited on him, much like I suppose you would do with Peppercorn.
Well, there's a long tradition of this. I mean, Anne Sexton, I read her biography over the summer, and when she was doing the circuit, a lot of times she would just go up there hammered and then take people out and hold court afterwards, in the same way. And it was Lacan did this. Right. Lacan did this.
I mean, in some ways, I don't mean to be a jerk about this, but in some ways, this feels like but a definitive aspect of our thing, and I hope it's changing in some ways, because I
think it is.
I will say this. I am inculcated enough into this system that I'm sad to see it go. I think because in this gross way, I always wished that I could be that person.
Right.
But I'm also sort of happy to see that it might be changing. But the section 594. It really stood out to me in part because I have had this experience so many times.
Okay.
They're at the dinner, and there's this kind of moment where Peppercorn's really just talking to Hans.
Right.
And he offers this thing. He's like, I was about to call you my brother.
Yeah.
But it's maybe a little too soon.
Yeah.
And it's hard to tell.
It sets up that later moment.
Yes, that happens 80 pages later, 60 pages later. But it's hard to tell how much this is calculated and how much this is genuine, and this is one of the things about great people. Is you can't tell.
Right.
They have this gift for doing things that seem really natural and almost like without thought.
Yeah.
But they also could be really calculated. And he's like, I was going to do this, but I'm not gonna put that on you right now.
Right.
Little brother.
Right.
And there's a little bit of old 1978 WWF kind of dusty roads, kind of, along with, some
maybe a little Matthew McConaughey mixed in there as well. Yeah,
there's that kind of character for good and bad.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're kind of talking about, he's kind of talking to Hans about this great thing Hans has just said, and then the part that really stands out to me, about a quarter of the way down, Hans Castorp was suddenly driven to realize that Pieperkorn was very drunk. Still, his drunkenness was not debasing. There was no loss of dignity. Rather, it combined with the nobility of his nature to produce an immense and awe-inspiring effect. And then it goes on. I mean, for a couple of paragraphs here, most of the page, it goes on. And I think this is the moment where I actually got a little bit of a chill here. And I don't think of this as a book that's like full of affect.
Right.
But I got a little bit of a chill here because I feel like this is the moment that Hans kind of went all into the cult of personality here, right? And I have so many memories of being around these like great people when I was younger, people who I was told were great or people who I just decided were great, who couldn't do wrong. That they would. I remember a guy. I shouldn't say who, but I remember a guy just getting like wrecked at a dinner party.
Yeah.
I mean, just getting like drunker than I think I've ever seen anybody else get and stay conscious.
Yeah.
And behave so badly in the process. And I remember at the time thinking, well, this is just what you have to do when you're somebody like that.
Right.
Like sometimes you have to do this because the weight of their own greatness is so heavy, And I remember
it's scary. It's scary.
Uninvited, creating this narrative that explained this away, and I mean,
and it is that sort of thinking that leads to unnecessary wars when enough people will follow, right? Which is why I think the modernists, to circle it back, began to reject this kind of thing, you know?
But, and this is where I was kind of going with this, but the other way this sounds really familiar to me, this feels an awful lot like those kind of late modernists, postmodernists, who still had that kind of cult of masculinity. I mean, this feels a lot like Hemingway to me.
Yeah.
Who I think rejected this romantic idea.
Sure.
Who was moving, who probably didn't respect Thomas Mann a whole lot.
Right.
But still had, I don't know, whatever fortitude it took to write on a page, he was too great to be judged.
Yes.
I think the same way Joseph Conrad was doing, and the same way writers continue to do today.
They do, yeah.
And so I'm fascinated by, what these characters who have largely been defined by their kind of minutia up until this point.
Right.
Just like the tininess of their little fishbowl lives, right?
Yeah.
That just get exploded, and I love that trick, by the way.
Yeah.
And then but look how rich it is if you look close enough. And then we get this guy who just comes rolling in with no apparent concern about anything.
Yeah.
Right. He's just going to turn this hospital into his banquet hall. He doesn't care. He's like a figure out of Norse mythology.
I mean, significantly while drinking himself to death.
Yeah.
And everybody knows that's why he's dying.
Yeah, and there's just no pretense about it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he's kind of tragic from the start. He does that thing early on where he calls the dwarf to the table and does that like intricate kind of thing where he orders bread and he goes, by bread I mean Jen.
Right, right.
And it's the kind of thing that drunk people think is really clever. It's the kind of thing that alcoholics think, mean they aren't alcoholics.
Right.
And it's sort of pathetic.
Yeah.
But then here he is, like literally this kind of this kind of figure on a dais, being everything. And I think by the time we get done with that section that we were talking about earlier, where Claudia and Hans have that frank discussion, I think by the end of that, they are both all in. They're just like, well, we don't care what the world says. This guy is our Godhead.
Yeah.
And we're going to. I mean, I think they know he's dying.
Yeah.
Right. And they are going to see this through to the end. And I think it's a crazy.
It's wild.
It's a crazy detour. I'm sometimes tempted to think, this is a tangent I take a lot. My unpopular reading of the novel Fight Club is that everything that happens in that book essentially is the result of the unnamed narrator's inability to acknowledge that he's in love with Marla.
Right.
Right. So he has to like destroy the entire credit system of the world, and all this because it's easier for him to do that than it is for him to just kind of say like, man, she's neat.
Yeah.
and I kind of feel like we're doing something similar here, that this is the answer that Mon contrived to get out of the kind of pickle he was in with Claudia and Hans.
Well, yeah, because when Piepercorn dies, I mean, Claudia calls Hans into the room and says, you had a right to be here. And Hans, kind of like with dignity, says, you're right, I did. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was interesting. Like, one of his least obsequious moments with her. Yeah. He's just like, straight up, yes, I should have been here. Mm-hmm. You're a good call. And then with really no fanfare, Claudia's gone. And I have the feeling we're not going to see her again. I could be wrong. Like we're going to finish the book in 2 weeks.
I think
that solved it. That ended
it. Really it. Let me.
And that's interesting.
Speaking of this ending, let me. So they have this conversation about, Piepercorn. I think something that redeems him somewhat. And let me just say, like, in ways that I feel like are somewhat disconnected from my moral sensibility, I love him.
Sure.
I mean, he's a great character.
Well, and also, just to go back to my earlier thread, isn't there something maybe great with a capital G, certainly Mensch-like, in a guy who got, it's your girlfriend or your wife, and here's this other guy who's been pining after her for a long time. You bust him on it. He admits it. And then, first of all, you're like, I'm sorry that I caused you this grief unintentionally.
Right.
Also, we are brothers.
Right.
Like, man, that's not... I just want to go back to this. That's not easy to do, and maybe it should be a little easier to do. Like, maybe there is something... This sounds so trite, but maybe there really is something proprietary about jealousy that means that jealousy... is the worst part of our nature. I guess it's one of the 7 deadly sins, isn't it? Like, one of the versions of it. But then we also will say things like, "Oh, but that's my fucking wife." Mm-hmm. Well, but okay. Is that the same as like your book or your your stereo and even those things? Right. Would you really throw away?
Look, if this were a Fellini movie, what would happen is they'd have that, and I totally 100% agree. This conversation that they have, and I think this is the beginning of the end, as well as the beginning of the beginning in a way.
Yeah.
They have this conversation, and Piepercorn, like you said, busts him on it, and it's great. It's
just in the middle of the conversation.
Yeah, she's like, so here's the thing.
Yeah.
And not only that, but he starts flipping through the receipts.
Yeah.
Like he remembered, like, and this is, I will say, this is a feature of these men that I was making fun of 10 minutes ago, who hold forth and act great. Like, one of the things that they all do seem to be able to do is to get drunk as skunks and yet remember the important things.
Yeah.
And yet the next day they can show up with this thing that you're like, wow.
Right.
Like, you actually took all that home with you and processed it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so he's been sitting on this. He knew from the night of that banquet, right? When they wouldn't kiss. When they wouldn't kiss. He put it together, and he's watching, he's paying attention, and there's some still water running deep there.
Yeah.
And he, one of the things that might be a way to admire him is he didn't think that was important enough that he, like, Set and Brini and Naphtha, they can't have a stray thought without writing a dissertation about it in front of people.
Right.
It's got to be an audience.
Yeah.
Right. And we even get to watch this. One more
which
debate.
Was funny about the waterfall scene.
Well,
when Piepercorn made them be in a place where they couldn't talk.
Exactly.
That was awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so he gets up and he gives the speech.
Nobody
can hear, right? That it's just like noise. It's all noise.
Yeah.
Right. Even my own bullshit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's this moment of redemption. But here's what I want to ask. So there's this, like, the way I see it. There's a kind of a 3-part maneuver at the ending. There's this. He's struck by this fever or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, to be honest. Sure, maybe he's got tropical diseases.
Yeah.
He's lived in this coffee plantation for however long.
It's his liver.
But part of me is like, dude, you're just an alcoholic.
Yeah.
You know, you're a late stage alcoholic. Who has made the decision to just keep riding hard, and this is what that looks like.
Yeah.
But whatever, right?
Yeah.
But he has that talk where he makes Hans come clean. And he's great about it, right? He's like, in a Fellini film, the way this ends is a threesome,
right?
But this is not that.
This is not that,
right?
Yeah.
And
nor should it be.
I'm this glad case. It was.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, like there, it is. I think Fellini and Mann agree that what this means is that there's now an intimacy around all three of them.
That's a true story.
Something.
That's
right. Yeah. They now share this thing that is important.
Yeah.
And Peppercorn, for all his other bullshit, he gets it and it matters.
Yeah.
And I think we see that in this trek to the waterfall. We see a little bit of that, right? And then he's dead, right?
Yeah.
And like the 6:55, Hans has been called to the bedside. He's already dead.
Yeah.
Right. And I have to admit, I was a little shocked to see it's a suicide. He's poisoned himself with this needle,
like acidic, like weird, like dangerous substance.
Like cobra venom.
Because isn't Hofrat like? By the way, don't touch that.
Right. Yeah,
like don't even touch
blister your skin.
Yeah.
Says,
yeah.
Right? It's that caustic.
Yeah.
And then they have this. Claudia and Hans have this talk, like literally over his body.
Right.
He's standing there, and she says he knew of our folly.
Yeah.
Right? So I was not able to prevent it. He guessed when I refused to kiss you on the forehead. At this moment, his presence is rather symbolic than actual. But will you let me do it now?
Mm-hmm.
And so he does the little kiss, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of
nothing like the Russian kiss they shared,
kiss,
but
right?
Somehow more intimate.
Right? But in part because it's within the context of this actual relationship.
Yeah.
Right? Because at least the body of,
Well, there's all the difference in the world between a lustful kiss and your family kiss. Right. Like kissing someone on the forehead because you care for them is different than kissing them on the mouth because you want them.
And it's also it feels to me like it's enacting this kind of like possibility that is no longer possible, and so there's this kind of built-in, I don't know, nostalgia for something that never was or couldn't be or something like that. But here's the question that kind of circles this for me. So lots of reasons Peppercorn might kill himself.
Yeah.
I mean, it might just be like straight up alcoholic instability. I
think the implication is he's in a lot of pain.
I think there's that too. But it's also like very soon after he kind of like forces the issue with Hans about Claudia. Is he getting? I mean, he says to Hans, one of his first reactions, and I think it's great, right? Because it's very kind of blustery in the form of this character, where he says, if I weren't so messed up, I'd offer to duel you.
Yeah.
So you could get this sorted out. And I think the suggestion is that he doesn't really want to fight. He just wants to make Hans
feel better,
feel okay about things. And I find myself wondering, to what extent is this also him thinking, I've had a good run. I'm going to get out of this guy's way. I like him. I like her. It makes sense. In what way is this a kind of a misguided attempt to sort of force the issue between them? Because they won't kiss because he's there, right? And so he's like, well, I'll just remove the obstacle.
Well, if that was his intention, it sure didn't work.
Right.
I mean, I'll just say that, right? Like, if what he was thinking was for whatever reason, under the guiding hand of Thomas Mann, his death actually doomed.
It puts the
unless the last 100 pages are going to be something very different than what I'm expecting.
Yeah.
Like, I guess she could roll in, offer Surrender in a gentleman's style, and carry him out of the house, but I just doubt it.
I don't see it. Although what an alternative ending.
Yeah.
You know, in the bottom of Mann's trash can. This version.
Yeah.
But I'm sort of taken with this question of you know, there are all these reasons. There's all these obvious reasons why he's in pain. He's not fundamentally a happy person.
No.
Anymore.
I don't think he ever was.
You know, and I kind of find myself thinking, you know, I find myself putting this narrative and, you know, imposing a narrative on him, which is he meets Claudia. You know, they're doing whatever, you know, tuberculosis circuit they're doing. He meets Claudia. She is, we just have to accept, magical. That every man who meets her is like, oh my God.
Well, because all the other guys, like in the carriages,
the guy just bitterly complaining.
It's like, why can't I just fondle her?
Right.
This is very incel.
Yeah, very, very.
Like that's interesting. I can't remember the guy's name, but he sounded a lot like the Reddit threads.
Absolutely.
That people are pointing out in 2022.
Right.
The sort of like, you know, the Jordan Peterson clientele.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is like outraged.
Right.
Because what I want is so little. Why can't she just let me have this? Like, and somehow, you know, it becomes under Mann's guidance. I think like he's anticipating 100 years in advance.
Yeah.
Something that we're now seeing is like once again on the scene,
or rather something that always has.
Sure.
You know, and we just sometimes we pay more attention to it.
Yeah,
you know,
we're in another moment, I guess.
Something, you know, but I mean, something tells me that there's no shortage in history of men going, but all I want is. You know?
I agree with that. I guess what I'm saying is it's just the rhetoric is so similar.
The language, absolutely. And the fact that he's complaining to Hans, like you can't understand because she talks to you,
right?
You know, and there's almost this great chain of being. You know,
I agree with
how
you that
close you are to Claudia defines.
I agree with you that it means that he's imbuing this character with a mythos, and that he has, as a writer, though we have certainly identified flaws in the book, successfully done what a lot of authors try to do, and including Hemingway with Brett in The Sun Also Rises.
Absolutely.
It's hard to pull off.
Yeah.
The sort of magical woman. A lot of writers have tried it. Most fail.
Yeah,
this book succeeds.
I feel like it's there, and so in part because of that, I want to impose this narrative on Peppercorn, where he knows, right? He's not a dummy.
Yeah.
And you know, and I mean, man, like, you know, in a different life, I could totally see myself making the same kind of choice and just saying like, okay, I got 6-8 months, right? Whatever. I'm gonna find a pretty girl who won't ask too much of me, and we're gonna you know
live it up.
We're gonna light the rocket and ride it to the end.
Yeah.
And so, you know, part of me is like, okay, that's just what it was, right? And this obviously this trip to the waterfall, which I looked up, by the way. It's like it's really dramatic.
Yeah.
This location.
Yeah.
And you know, this idea that he goes to this place that's like, you know, the oblivion of noise, and
it's his last outing.
He makes his final, you know, points. You know, in this classic, like, you know, nobody really cares anyway kind of gesture, and then comes home and, you know, you know, and so, you know, in that sense, it makes perfect sense. But I also feel like in a way there's so many potentials, like because this guy is such he stands in for such a kind of ubiquitous character in our kind of like historical narratives of masculinity. There are all these versions of the story, and I'm intrigued at the possibility that this is his attempt to sort of like, you know, essentially, you know, play matchmaker, and if so, he's so wrong that what it really is this ultimate sort of disavowal of his greatness.
I think so. I you know, it's intentionally left unclear why he killed himself, but I think we're certainly asked to consider that one way he did it was he was bowing out of the quote-unquote competition.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I guess I would say that maybe the reason that it doesn't work, if we were to talk about that for a second, is that you got to figure on some level if peppercorn was enough to come between us, we just aren't meant to be. No matter how we feel about each other, like, damn, we had all this time, and you wound up with this guy. And from her point of view, it's like, I wound up with this guy, not you. We've been through the gauntlet now. It's too late. And maybe that's, a lot of times people can have the real deal.
Yeah.
And still they don't work it out. Right. And I love that in literature. Yeah. I kind of resent the romantic comedy in some way. Not that I won't watch it and eat ice cream and Cheetos with the best of them. But sometimes I'm like, you're implying, and this even goes to Shakespeare. I'm not just talking about Hollywood. You're implying that if the real deal is there, it is likely that it will be had. And that's just not my experience in life.
Not in the world I live.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. I think, and I think there's this kind of other feature, right? I'm reminded of a thing I read, I forget where, that kind of was going through the list of like the really dangerous things that broke up marriages.
Right.
And top of the list, death of a child.
Right. Of course.
And not having children. I can't feel this the way I'm sure, somebody with kids could, but I totally get it, at least intellectually, that here's this thing, literally the product of your union, and you just can't disassociate.
That's right.
And I get it, right? An interesting detail, I think the second thing under that was like moving house.
Yeah.
Like moving is so stressful, it can ruin your marriage.
Yeah.
But I kind of feel like that's sort of what happens here, right? Is that Claudia and Hans had already, even if they didn't know it, they'd already recognized that they couldn't be together. What they could do is be with Peppercorn.
Yeah.
But what they couldn't do is be together. And so when this ride with Peppercorn stops, they know what this means. And I think partly it's the trauma of this. I mean, the Greek myths, I think, get it best. The exposure to the gods is horrific.
Yeah.
It is amazing and wonderful and horrific.
You really don't want it.
Yes.
Usually the gods are the villains and the humans are the sympathetic characters in these stories.
And even when they're not the villains.
Yeah.
Like they're just...
it's too much.
They just can't. You can't come back.
Yeah.
Like they send you back, but you can't come back.
Right.
You're ruined.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happened. That this relatively short but super intense experience with whatever this throuple, where Hans and Claudia are just gonna we're just gonna worship this guy.
Yeah.
We're in agreement.
Yeah.
I don't care what anybody says.
Yeah.
Has in a way ruined them for each other and for the world, and I think they both know that, and that's why they just scatter.
Yeah.
When he's gone, and then Hans is left with this weird kind of final bit of the reading where the doctor, and this feels a bit romantic to me too, kind of like all those like Dickens sort of coincidences. Like it's like, oh, by the way, now that your reason for staying here is gone, also so is your illness.
Right.
It's like ding ding ding.
Yeah.
And and that kind of thing. And I don't really know. To be honest, I don't know that I care a whole lot.
Yeah.
It feels like a plot device. It feels like a way to get somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I was a bit taken right at the end, at 667, with Hans's distaste for the process of making the vaccine. Right? They culture his blood to see which bacteria grow.
Yeah.
And then they make this vaccine out of it, right? Which feels like a really timely conversation.
Yeah.
But he says he submitted to the treatment. This is the last paragraph of today's reading. Though he found it absurd, contemptible, this inoculation of himself with part of himself just feels like, in a way, like if I were going to teach this book in a class, if I were going to do a class that was just Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, the subtitle of that class would be Inoculating Yourself with Yourself.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that what's been going on all along, right, is that in one way or another he's been given these different perspectives on who he is or who he could be, and he he's trying to kind of like work through whatever the result of that particular collision is going to be. And now that he's faced with this like relatively straightforward version of it, he's like, ugh, gross.
Yeah.
And it feels like and this is also the section that goes over how there are these fashions for like stamp collecting or solitaire.
Yeah.
And
they become obsessed with cards.
And he's playing this like increasingly mindless game, and I'm reminded of. I hope this isn't like too frank, but I'm reminded of these moments that I have where, I'm just so burnt and I'm so depressed or whatever that that like a Saturday once a year will come up where all I can muster is like 3 hours of solitaire on my phone.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like, ugh.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's where, he's just kind of wrung out.
Yes.
Right? And the doctor's like, I think we can fix you and send you home. And he's like, ugh. Nothing's left.
Yeah. And it'll be curious to see where we go from here. I mean, we are going to finish the book, and we only have, 23 plus 52, so 75 pages to go.
Where does mine ends
667 to 752.
752, yeah, you're right, yeah.
So, we will finish this, we'll have our last meeting in 2 weeks, and we'll see if we're surprised by the ending, if we, what sort of broad interpretations we might bring.
Well, let me ask you now, like, here we are,
yeah,
relatively close. I mean, it's like just over the hill, the ending of this. I was thinking a lot about, and I don't know why, but I was thinking a lot today before we talked about the way that this book began with what felt like this really long. Like at the time, I was like, "Oh, this is really long," and then I felt like every couple of weeks, Thomas Mann was like, "You thought that was long,
right?"
But this really long kind of defense of our protagonist as a normal guy,
right?
And I feel like I have totally lost that thread, and I'm wondering. I guess I'm gonna say I'm hoping that what the end does is somehow bring me back to this, like, he's a normal guy and this is why that matters. But what are you thinking? Either what are you expecting or what are you hoping for in the end?
I guess I'm still expecting some version of him coming back, except the war has happened.
So you want?
I think it's an interesting juxtaposition, because he was like, this is before the big thing, like in the prologue.
It's true.
And it just seems like, if you're going to be up there so isolated, caught up in all this abstract stuff, to return to the ruin that is going to be Germany.
Yeah.
Like it's not going to be the flatland where shipbuilding is the thing anymore. It's going to be something completely different. Maybe the kind of thing Settembrini has been warning against all along. I do not know. But I think some reference to, while you were up there, everything collapsed, I guess is what I'm expecting. But if I'm wrong, then okay, we'll see.
Yeah, okay. Well, that last thing you said reminded me that I think we saw the last of Settembrini in this reading.
Maybe so.
And that may hint at the kind of thing you're talking about, that humanism is gone and what's left is this kind of mechanical nightmare.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of an interesting. I hadn't thought about putting those two things together.
What about you?
I gotta say, I think I'm feeling. I don't know if this is by Mann's design. I think I'm feeling so wrung out at this point that I kind of just want it to end somehow.
Right. We're going to get that.
I'm really ready for it to just kind of be done.
Be done with the book.
It's that long car drive. Like, just got to power through these last couple hours.
Yeah.
And get where we're going. And so there's that. I do hope that I feel like what I was promised in the beginning, and I honestly can't tell you exactly why I feel like this at this point, but at some moment, months ago, I was under the impression that what I was about to read was a book that kind of experimented with the idea that an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances leads to something.
Right.
And I'm hoping that I get some kind of classic payoff, in the sense of, you know, and thus, reader, you know, the lesson is.
Yeah.
Not just because I hope to like absorb that lesson, but because otherwise I don't know what I'm going to sort of like pull toward or push off from.
Yeah.
In my ultimate feelings about the book, because I sort of feel like right now, you know, especially with this Peepercorn stuff, I kind of feel like we're 600 something, you know, almost 600 pages in.
More now.
Yeah.
I mean, well, where are we?
Not quite, I think.
Yeah, 667.
Okay, so it's just,
we're almost at 700.
Yeah, close to 700 pages in, and I feel like, you know, if somebody just burst into the door and was like, "Hey, what's that book about?"
Yeah.
I feel like I would just do a lot of like,
yeah.
Which is not a terrible thing.
Right.
But I don't think that's what I expect. So I guess what I'm going to say is this: I hope that by this time 2 weeks from now, I hope to be in a position to say, well, I think the book thinks it's about this.
Yeah.
And then I can go from there.
Yeah. A little bit of